introduce our first speaker. We have Eleonora Marocchini. And do you have slides you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll try and share them. Okay, do you see them?
Yeah,
Cool.
over
Okay.
to you.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for having my work featured in the reader. As mentioned, I will be speaking about social communication and more specifically pragmatics, but for anyone who has never heard the term, I will define it. I'm currently an independent scholar at the Institute for Globally Distributed Open Research and Education, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I thought I would introduce myself briefly because I think it makes a lot of sense that I wrote this because it's kind of the same way of evolution from more traditional views of social communication towards more critical views of social communication and pragmatics. I started as a humanist, then I went on with a PhD in psychology and cognitive sciences. You can still find some of my very traditional pathologizing works from the first year of my PhD, where I was focusing on autistic deficits in pragmatics and more specifically on eye functioning autism. Obviously, I regret most of this, but that's where I come from, so I figured I would share this. And after that, I went on with independent research, mainly because the field would not kind of adapt to new critical lenses, let's say. And that's how I got in contact with Damien and like most neurodiversity studies and then critical neurodiversity studies. And that's what I'm currently doing research within as a framework. So, how's the contribution designed and what will I focus on today? The contribution is a bit more dense than what I will share today, of course. It has a couple of parts where I kind of describe the traditional views of empathy and social communication and pragmatics in general and in autism specifically, and kind of show how they're really ambiguous and kind of not really clear as to what they actually mean with mind reading, for instance, or empathy for that matter. Then I go a little bit more into the disruptive potential of the double empathy problem in rethinking empathy and pragmatics. For the scope of this talk, I'm gonna assume that you know what double empathy is. So we'll go through that like very, very briefly. And I'd rather focus on the rather novel contribution to the topic in terms of how we can reframe empathy and pragmatics in autism and in general through the double empathy lens. I will share a couple of examples of reframings in this specific field, and I'll end up talking a bit about cross-neurotype communication as a cross-cultural process and potentially call for a neurodivergent pragmatics, but that's, I mean, let's see if I get there. Um, so I'll start with kind of describing what social communication usually entails. When we talk about social communication, we refer to a very complex and broad concept that usually encompasses social cognition and social interaction, but also language, and more specifically, the pragmatic dimension of language. It's usually kind of perceived as a very technical term, so it's not common to see it mentioned in works on communication that do not necessarily investigate linguistic aspects, but it's actually very important in cross-neurotype communication. Obviously, as in any other field, traditional academic postures in social communication as a subfield kind of led to otherizing behaviors and epistemic injustice, defined as an asymmetry of power performed on knowledge through knowledge, because most researchers in social communication don't really interrogate themselves, especially when they come from side disciplines, um, on their posture, let's say, and positionality towards the topic, and their most oftenly neurotypical people, especially when they investigate social communication in populations that they perceive and frame as clinical population. What is pragmatics more specifically? It's a subdiscipline, let's say, or a level of language also, even a set of skills. Sometimes we refer to them as like pragmatic competence or pragmatic skills that focus on the use of language in context. So the assumption is that there's a speaker that speaks and implies meanings that are beyond the literal meanings, and a listener, on the other hand, that has to infer or deduce the implied meanings beyond the literal ones. The idea is that it describes the processes of comprehension and production, also of implying figurative meanings, indirect meanings, or ironic meanings. And as such, it was historically linked to empathy and theory of mind, because it's a process or a set of processes that relies on intention recognition mechanisms. We have to understand what the communicative intention is in order to understand the implied meanings. That's the idea. So what about autistic pragmatics? Obviously, since social cognition and pragmatics have traditionally been conceived as intertwined, they're usually considered to be impaired in autistic people. We started off with the unitary pragmatic deficit hypothesis. We now kind of know that a lot of pragmatic phenomena are preserved in autism. That's the way it's usually talked about. And we know this because we've done a lot of studies where mainly the idea was to compare autistic people and an autistic group to a neurotypical group, or at least a non-autistic group, in several pragmatic phenomena comprehension. Of course, by this kind of statistic analysis, we kind of lose insights on cognitive diversity, both within the neurotypical group and within the autistic group. But regardless, like we found that on a lot of pragmatic phenomena, actually, depending on how you study those, autistic participants actually perform similarly to neurotypical people. So what do neurotypical researchers usually say about this? They usually suggest that even when they perform similarly, we should not interpret surface level performance as actual competence. And they usually frame autistic strategies as alternative strategies or compensation strategies. So obviously the concept of compensation itself kind of suggests a supposed superiority of the typical strategies that are framed as normal, and also as a single standard route, which kind of doesn't really represent even what happens in neurotypical comprehension strategies, because there might be more than one for most pragmatic phenomena. But also, what's more interesting when we look at autistic performance in pragmatic studies specifically is that these studies sometimes present contradictions in the way they interpret very similar data depending on the group that shows these kind of data. So I've put here a quote by Gensbacher and Pripascapit where they discuss how when non-autistic people exceed autistic people's in left medial prefrontal activity during sarcasm detection, it's due to an autistic deficit. And when autistic people exceed non-autistic people, it is due to an autistic deficit. So regardless of who's showing more activation, there's always an autistic deficit to explain it. Now, if we look at other subfields of pragmatics that are not clinical pragmatics, we see concepts that are less otherizing, like co-constructed discourse or meaning negotiation. And that happens because conversational partners are usually framed as equals. And that happens in social linguistics or in intercultural pragmatics, for instance. We know that social cultural aspects of the context and the identity of the speakers have a role both in the production of pragmatic phenomena and mutual comprehension. But these are not taken into account when we look at populations that are considered clinical population. And that's something that Hillary explained in terms of autistic people not getting a culture. Like we do not get a culture in terms of we're not perceived as a group that has social and cultural meanings that are shared, but rather we are defined in terms of what we are lacking in cognitive terms, the way clinical pragmatics frames us. So, um, if we use the double empathy problem within this context of pragmatics, we can see that the double empathy problem can reframe cross neurotype interaction as a disjuncture in reciprocity between two differently disposed social actors. I cannot say it better than this. So what that means is that we can also kind of test this empirically, and we've done it. So there's a lot of studies now that have confirmed that non-autistic people also have difficulties understanding autistic people, and that autistic people kind of understand each other pretty well, at least as much as neurotypical people do with each other. So on this basis, we reframed the deficits in autistic pragmatics as a mutual misunderstanding process between autistic and non-autistic people. And that's something that was mainly done by Williams, Crompton, and obviously a lot of their colleagues and other people, because now we do have a lot of studies kind of using this lens. Of course, these are not as widely cited as the traditional ones, but we do have them. Another interesting fact is that it's not just the double empathy problem kind of highlighting this, and not only in clinical terms, because if we look at social neuroscience, for instance, there's a lot of discourse going on about biases towards in-group favoritism, and that's true in general of anyone. If we look at mutual understanding and empathy, that is obviously always impacted by sharing similar experiences of being in the world, whatever these experiences are. So, if we look at literature, for instance, on culture and ethnicity and racialization, what we see is that everyone kind of shows these biases towards in-group favoritism, and that implies that social learning and group belonging kind of shape the way empathy is displayed and understood. And that's crucial here because autistic people are often aware of how their difference shapes interactions with neurotypical people specifically, whilst neurotypical people rarely take this into account. So that kind of leads to discrimination and also implicit discrimination a lot of the
Mhm.
times. So I get to the couple of examples that I wanted to give you of what happens in this literature, and how using a double empathy lens kind of puts in danger some of the given assumptions in the field. First of all, the concept of a faux pas, which you might not know of, but it's basically a situation where somebody says something that another person might not want to hear, with unintended negative consequences. So, in order to even define what a faux pas is, we need to have a normative approach to embarrassment, um, which again, neuroscience describes as a complex emotion with both biological and socially constructed bases. So we might have very different conceptions of what an awkward situation might be. But faux pas, again, when we look at clinical pragmatics literature, are tested through stories that are created according to the neurotypical, or even better, neuronormative social rules. So obviously, a neurodivergent or at least an autistic social cognition might prioritize different aspects of interaction. For instance, truthfulness over pleasantries. But also that can mean obviously that they display some sort of a deficit if viewed that way. But also we see that at least some autistic adults actually over-detect faux pas. So they kind of see faux pas where they're not there, according to neurotypical people, because they learn shame and they kind of learn how frequently their perspective does not align with that of the majority. So they kind of have these experience-based social schemas of shame that make them say, yeah, that's a faux pas. I shouldn't have said that, or that person shouldn't have said that, even though they wouldn't see any problem in there, but they've learned that there might be a problem there, and they even do it more than neurotypical people. On the other hand, if we look at literature on neurotypical people and pragmatics in neurotypical people, there's another concept that is very interesting, that is the concept of unwanted inferences. So these are instances where a speaker explicitly cancels a potential implicature. It's a little bit more complicated, but basically is what in those cases where a person might say, so this is okay, but of course I do not mean that that is not. So kind of preempting that the interlocutor would interpret something that they didn't say. So kind of shows that the neurotypical speakers often anticipate the listener's interpretation without the interlocutor even talking. And this is a strategy that can be used whenever they perceive the risk of misunderstanding as a preventative conversational repair, or whenever they want to frame it as such. But anyway, um, what's interesting about this is there's literature on it, and it kind of describes neurotypical mind reading strategies as kind of based into these processes of constructing others' mental states by generalizing the person's point of view. That obviously is based in their own neurotype and their own previous interactions. So as such, it can only reliably hold when the other person is neurotypical too. Because if I'm using myself and generalizing my view to kind of imagine what the listener's interpretation might be, the other person has to be neurotypical or I will be failing. So neurotypical theory of mind really sounds a lot like generalization. Uh, Once we realize that that is the case, so that both autistic or otherwise neurodivergent people kind of take into account the fact that other people might be seeing the world differently and kind of compensate for that, if we want to use that term. And on the other hand, neurotypical people kind of do not and use themselves as an example and generalize over that. We have to accept that empathy and theory of mind are much more linked to different dispositions of the social actors involved, shared experiences, socially constructed concepts, and unwritten rules of a social group, a specific social group, rather than to purely cognitive abilities. So at that point, we can even get to discuss the need for a clinical pragmatics to even exist. In Under this lens, the cross-neurotype pragmatics could be framed as intercultural pragmatics, because many definitions of culture include social, linguistic, personal, and political aspects. And the autistic identity is arguably both different from the neurotypical identity and definable in these terms, and also kind of intersecting with all of the other cultures that a person is part of. Although there's specific proposals of neurodivergent or at least autistic culture being centered around specific cultural categories like interest systems, sensory sensitivity, affect display, and social interactions, obviously viewed through an autistic lens. One of the consequences of using this lens is that if we think of those as cultural differences, we can then kind of treat them as such. And that means that cultural differences, once they're made explicit, are first of all expected and framed as mutual, although obviously cultural supremacy must be taken into account. And secondly, and most importantly, I think they can be taught and learned. While in the case of neurocognitive differences, normally we confine learning to neuropsychological or behavioral training that is provided to neurodivergent people. that is aimed at helping them fit in the neurotypical culture, or at least the neuronormative culture. However, it's not really easy to teach appropriate ways to interact. It's not even easy to come up with a list of autistic communication features, or even worse, if we want to target neurodivergent communication features. Because any kind of normative approach to interaction risks leaving behind all of the people who communicate differently from the norm or the new norm, even when this norm is a description of autistic communication or neurodivergent communication. Specifically, if when we talk about neurodivergent communication, what we actually mean is autistic communication, which is being generalized as neurodivergent. However, there is qualitative evidence that neurodivergent people who do not share the neurotype, for instance, autistic people talking with ADHD people, feel like communication is easier between them than with neurotypical people. So they do not share the same exact neurotype, but they do share the fact that they're neurodivergent. So this might be because they reject the norm or because they're consciously aware of the fact that the interlocutors will probably not align with the norm nor their norm. So I guess what I'm trying to say here and what I've tried to argue in the reader is that so the awareness of the fact that people actually function differently and communicate differently and possibly ask for more clarifications, for instance, not assuming that you would understand what is not being said, might be what it means to communicate within a conversational space where neurological, neuropsychological, cultural, and neurocultural differences are expected. And ultimately, this approach encourages a position of humility in the face of difference, which I find is a very nice way to put it, and respect for human diversity and neurodiversity as a whole. Um, I'll just mention here that I've went on with this line of work, partially thanks to a fellowship that I got through the Durham University and the Wellcome grant. Um, and I tried to decenter autism in this discussion because obviously once you try and kind of divert from epistemic injustice, you should decenter dominant perspectives rather than creating a new center within the margins, which is what's kind of happening with autism now, because we've been studying autism under double empathy framework for way longer than we have for any other sort of neurodivergence, although, of course, we cannot think of those as conditions in the same way that clinical pragmatics would. So I tried to critically analyze a handbook of clinical pragmatics to kind of offer a neuroqueer reading of communicative features that are described as pragmatic impairments for other forms of neurodivergence, or at least like developmental and acquired neurodivergence, in order to avoid saying autistic pragmatics when, or neurodivergent pragmatics when we actually mean autistic pragmatics. So what I found very briefly is that neurodivergent communication involves a lot of very different things, both speaking directly and tangentially, repetition, divergent associative patterns in thoughts, monologues, but also sudden shifts in conversations, various approaches to humor, plurality in terms of both voices heard or identities within the speaker, both very short and very long conversational turns, non-verbal responses, and both very direct and overly polite responses, for instance, as a consequence of masking and camouflaging being mixed with unmasked reactions. So when teaching cross-neurotype communication, or at least raising awareness on cross-neurotype communication, I think we should keep that in mind. And that's it for today. I thank you for your attention. I'd really like to have be able to take a couple of questions. My chapter is the third, and I am fairly responsive both via email and through several different social media. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting and lots of comments in the chat. I don't know if anybody's got any questions immediately. Oh, Damien.
There's something that came up in the presentation and that I commented on in the chat um, was the generalizing from one's own point of view, so an own experience. And this phenomenologically sort of called the natural attitude, um, and that other people are probably seeing what you're perceiving. I think.
Mm-hmm.
And in many autistic accounts, we also do this at a young age
Yeah.
until it's kind of bluntly pointed out to us that this is the wrong assumption to make.
Yeah.
We kind of realize this assumption's a kind of incorrect one quite early on. And sometimes, but
Yeah.
this is, in different accounts, it's just at different ages, that kind of realization. And I think that links to something else that was being chatted about in that
Yeah, I see it now.
in neurodivergent people, that greater tolerance for communication breakdown, more an assumption that things could go wrong. So giving people more leeway.
Yeah.
And so there might not be a sort of full empathetic kind of feeling or intuitive response, but there might be just a greater leniency given for faux pas, where and other errors of communication.
Yeah, I guess my take on this is, of course we do that too, but nobody thinks we're not doing it. Whilst when we think of neurotypical theory of mind, which is normally just referred to as theory of mind, because of course that's the standard, so we
Yeah.
don't even name it. So when we talk about that and we define that, we would never say that it's an overgeneralization of one's perspective. It's usually defined as reading the other person's perspective, but obviously everyone starts from their own experience.
Mm,
That's what I'm trying to argue, right? It's just that neurotypical people have less of that experience that you're mentioning that autistic people have, of people telling them that that does not work. Because obviously they're
right,
gonna meet more neurotypical people.
exactly.
Yeah.
I like that phrasing, the minefield effect of tentatively picking away through tricky territories in communication. I like that, Stephen.
And it shows you that cultural need for safe spaces, in a sense. And so, why autistic led activities and community spaces are often felt as a bit of a relief and sort of mask dropping effect and that kind of stuff talked about because it's um, less likely to feel judged. And I've heard non-autistic people visiting places like Ortscape talking about that as well, the non-judgmental uh, culture that it is felt by non-autistic people often as well. So it's quite interesting to ask non-autistic people in autistic-led spaces how they feel, what they feel is a bit different about those spaces, things like that. It's quite interesting insights. Is there any question? Oh, we've got a question. Um, could communication also be better between different neurotypes, e.g. autism and ADHD, simply because there's an overlap between these categories. We tend to think of,
I mean, yeah, that is an option, of course, but so the qualitative data that I was looking at when I mentioned that was from a focus group that well, several focus groups that I have done with people who were also just autistic or just ADHD, at least in terms of what they identified as. And they actually did say that, for instance, and there was a lot of autistic people saying, I actually feel like ADHD people have a communicative style that is a bit too aggressive to me. And that's something that I've been told about the way I talk as well. I talk a lot, like I'm very fast, for instance, or whenever ADHD people tend to have like very tangential thoughts and they just tell them right away, and autistic people sometimes need more structure. So they did say that some of these features of people they were not sharing the neurotype with were kind of difficult for them to keep up with. But at the same time, they did kind of hold more space because they were kind of expected. So I think of course it can help whenever there's an overlap, but even when there's no overlap, having this expectation of differences being there and uh, just awareness that that's the case most of the times. Because also even when we do share the neurotype, of course, other cultural aspects of our personality and identity and social groups are gonna be there and potentially not aligned, right? So I think this awareness and expectation is what kind of helps the most to target intersectionally all of the different positionalities that people embody in conversation. Although it's an idea, so
Um, yeah, so
yeah, yeah, confirms in the chat from ADHD people as well.
thank you. Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Such a really interesting presentation, Eleonora. Um, and people, I'm sure, will still, have a read through the chat. There may be some questions there that we
Yep.
missed. And then I think, perfect.